You're watching Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Glad to be joined from Providence, Rhode Island in the US by Dr. Ashish K. He's the Dean of the Brown University School of Public Health. Dr. Jha, I know you're giving back-to-back interviews all day long. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Dr. Jha, just taking off from that band on top of your head, which is the topic of what we are discussing, in terms of the vaccines that have started rolling out across the world in different countries in different measures, do you see this as the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning of COVID?
I see this as the beginning of the end. I think once we get vaccines out to a large majority of the world, the pandemic will come to an end. There will still be challenges. There will still be lingering problems. But really, it is vaccines that are going to bring this pandemic to an end. And I'm very excited that we are entering the vaccine phase of this pandemic.
Undoubtedly, vaccines will bring to an end of COVID, but we can talk about the efficacy of the vaccines that are out there. Just to get your sense of what's happening in the United States, and the latest forecast by the CDC suggests upwards of 500,000 people, it's forecast, could be killed by the week ending February 13th. The change in administration from Trump's policies to Biden's policies, how do you see that affecting the situation?
Yeah, so let's be honest. The United States response to the pandemic has been among the worst in the world, largely because of the failures of the Trump administration. And so I do see, I mean, we have more than 400,000 Americans died before Trump left office. So Mr. Biden, President Biden is inheriting a very difficult situation. And what I expect is over the next month or 6 weeks, another 100,000 Americans are going to die. So we will be at 500,000 deaths before the end of February. I think there are going to be some very large changes in policy under the Biden administration, but it will take a few weeks for those policies to begin to have an effect. And so I think we have to be a little bit patient, but by March or April, we really should be seeing the effects of the Biden administration.
What, in your view, were ex-President Trump's, what was his logic in the way he was handling the pandemic? You're talking about the situation, one of the worst in the world, and that's not what is expected from the United States of America. So what was really his logic in the way he handled it?
Yeah, I think the problem with Donald Trump was that he is not somebody who can manage complex situations. He sees everything as kind of black and white, pro him, anti him. He saw this pandemic as somehow personal, that the pandemic was somehow created as a personal critique of him. And so he downplayed and fought every effort to control the pandemic. He really turned the public health world, the medical world, into his enemy. And he spent almost all of his time criticizing physicians and public health experts. And of course, you know, you can't have that. You need a president who is aligned with public health. You need a president who works with the medical community, not who is fighting the medical community. And so it created a very toxic environment. His supporters, of course, then became people who didn't believe that the pandemic was real. They thought it was all a hoax created by China to somehow undermine the president. It was a very strange year. And I think we are all better off with that now being behind us. And now we can focus on the problem at hand.
When you're talking about focusing on the problem ahead around the world, and it was being expected and it happened. I mean, what is being called the UK variant, when there's mutation of the virus. How does that really affect it when the vaccine's already out there? I know there are studies that have been put out saying that they would probably deal with that to a certain percentage. How do these variants, I mean, when you're talking in security terms, when, you know, a new missile is developed and there's an anti-defense system that's developed on the other side, and when they're both mutating, so to speak, or developing or evolving, how does that work in terms of the virus?
Yeah. So there are a couple of things that are worth understanding. First of all, mutations are common in the virus. They happen all the time. Most mutations don't mean anything. They don't have any significance, any clinical significance. But every once in a while, some set of mutations do have a clinical significance. And that is what has happened with this UK variant. It's a set of mutations that has made the virus about 50% more contagious. The problem with that is that over time, it will end up causing big spikes in cases wherever it takes off. And the single most important thing we can do is to get people vaccinated. If we can get large numbers of people vaccinated, that will protect the virus, the variant, from infecting people. And I think it will end up making a very big difference. So in the US, right now, there's a race. It's a race of the variant versus the vaccine. And how quickly can we get people vaccinated? In India, vaccinations have also begun. I think India overall has done a much better job than the United States in terms of this pandemic. That said, India also needs to work on getting more and more people vaccinated with Covishield, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It's going to be very important for preventing spikes in India to get a larger proportion of people vaccinated.
Now, big countries like India, the US, Brazil, I mean, everyone had a different approach to both dealing with the pandemic and the rollout of the vaccines. Say, for example, a close neighbor of India, Bhutan, even though India is helping by sending viruses to them, they've decided to, say, stockpile the viruses till they have enough to vaccinate each and every person in Bhutan, which is, of course, like it's a smaller number in comparison to, say, India or the US. How does each country, how do you rate, say, the top 3 countries who've dealt with both COVID and the vaccine rollout?
Yeah, so there are certainly many countries that have done a good job with COVID, the virus and the pandemic itself. I actually think India has done a good job and should be commended. Certainly countries like South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, even Germany for much of the time has done a good job. Countries like the United States, UK, but many others have not. You know, in terms of the vaccine rollout, the country that's doing the very, very best is Israel. They have done very aggressive rollout of the vaccine. And America is doing okay. UK is doing reasonably well. You know, the Bhutan approach of stockpiling until everybody can get vaccinated actually doesn't make much sense from a public health point of view, because it's always worth remembering that when you vaccinate one person, you don't just protect them, you actually protect other people around them as well. So why would you not want to get that benefit by getting people vaccinated as soon as you have a vaccine? So every country is going to do this differently. What I'm very worried about, I'm worried about 2 things. I'm worried about one, that the wealthy countries will get vaccinated and quickly and the rest of the world will not. I think that's going to be very bad in many, many ways. And second, that some countries are going to use very high quality vaccines with very high levels of efficacy, and other countries are going to be stuck with mediocre vaccines that don't do much protection at all. And that also, I think, is going to be a real problem. So we want to try to make sure that we're addressing both of those issues moving forward.
So, Professor Jha, if I take the first point, which is the big countries, the wealthy countries, and even within countries, those who are wealthy, those who are prosperous, those who are in power, who get vaccinated first. Have we learned, as a world, learned the lessons of the past, say, when it was, in other cases, where a similar thing happened, you know, in terms of the powerful or the rich getting vaccinated first?
Yeah, that has been the tradition, right? The wealthy and the powerful always get access to these things first. But the lesson of the past, the lesson of this pandemic also, is that we don't live in bubbles. We don't live in isolated situations. And that as long as there are groups of people, individuals, countries that are not vaccinated, that are not adequately protected, that not only is it bad for them, they become the source of infections for other people around the world as well. Because we're all in this together. We're one world. We're one global community. I mean, think about this virus. It began in Wuhan, China, and pretty quickly spread throughout the whole world because we live in an interconnected and really interdependent world. So if we want to think just narrowly even about ourselves, it is in our personal interest to make sure that everybody around the world is vaccinated.
The second point you raised earlier was of the efficacy of the vaccines that are being used across the world. Can you elaborate on that and what you have gauged so far?
Absolutely. So you have a couple of vaccines, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, that appear to be over 95% effective. So very, very, very effective vaccines. Covishield, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, some mixed data on how effective it is, maybe 60 or 70%. At least there's some hint that there may be a dosing schedule that could get it over 90%. But so far, not convincing evidence that it can be quite as high as 95. But I think of it as a relatively good vaccine. Then you have vaccines like the Sinovac vaccine, the Chinese one, that actually looks like from the Brazil data that may only be 50% effective, which is a real problem because that means it's not a very effective vaccine at all. And so that to me is a huge challenge. And then, just even though I've been very positive about the way India has been handling things, India is, I think, still doing things that I'm very worried about. So the way that it has handled the Covaxin situation with this vaccine from the Bharat Institute, that it didn't even go through phase 3 trials. We don't know if Covaxin works or not. I know Covishield works, but we don't know if Covaxin works. And one of the points that I've been trying to make is, look, Russia did the same thing with Sputnik 5. Russia did not even do the full clinical trials before it gave it authorization. But that would never happen in America. That would never happen in Western Europe. And India's scientific community should be held to the same standard as we hold the scientific community of America and Western Europe, because India's scientific community is terrific. It's world class. And I don't know why the regulators would allow for a vaccine to be authorized without phase 3 trials. That has not made sense to me. I think India deserves better. India should be doing better. India's scientific community and scientific capability should be at the same level as everybody else in the world, as the top countries in the world.
Well, one of the reasons that was given by the leadership, both political and in terms of health, was that it was, excuse me, a backup. And, by the time it was needed, the trials would have been done. But do you have any comments on that?
I mean, a backup vaccine that we don't know if it works or not is not much of a backup vaccine. My take is we should do the clinical trials, find out if it works. And if it works, then let's use it widely. And if it doesn't work, then let's discard it. So that should be the strategy. There should really be no other approach. I don't think until we have shown it in clinical trials to work, it doesn't seem to me reasonable to think of it as a vaccine that we want to use more broadly in the population.
Professor Jha, you mentioned Sputnik V, the Russian vaccine. Now, their reasoning or their logic or their argument is that because of the competition, there is propaganda from the West, from the Western government, from the Western media that is targeted against that vaccine. I mean, but there are strict medical, boundaries that should actually be followed, right? I mean, how do you react to their justification, the Russian justification?
Yeah, there's always critique in national propaganda. I personally avoid all of that, and I try to look at the underlying scientific data. And I ask the question, how good is the scientific data? And for instance, the scientific data on the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines pretty good. The scientific data on the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are quite good. I have the scientific data on Sputnik, the Russian vaccine. It's just not, they haven't been super transparent. It isn't there. I'm not saying it's not a good vaccine. It may be. I just don't know. And the strategy that they should have is they should make all their data widely available, very public, let the scientists evaluate it, and ignore the propaganda and ignore the nationalism sniping. Just share the data widely. If it's a good vaccine, people will see it and people will feel more comfortable taking it.
When you're talking about a good vaccine and people being comfortable taking it now across the world, there is a segment of a population that is very hesitant when it comes to vaccinations. There's a lot of disinformation, there's a lot of misinformation, and a lot of information as well that's out there. So how do you target those who are skeptical about vaccination?
Yeah, this is a huge challenge. I think my personal approach on this has been one of 2 or 3 things. One is speaking openly and plainly and honestly with people. And that's why I have been calling for more transparency and openness with data, is because when you don't have that, then the conspiracy theorists, the fear mongers, use the lack of transparency to spread rumors. And so the most important thing we can be doing is being very transparent with data, being very open and having people see it themselves. Second is you also need trusted voices. So it's not just having data and making sure people can see it, but having people who are trusted in communities, people who are whose voices are valued, them speaking up. So it can't just be scientists and public health experts like me. It's also got to be religious leaders, and it has to be others who can look at this and say, yeah, this is important, this is good. They need to speak up. This has got to be an all of society effort. It just can't be scientists or politicians saying this is good and this is worth doing.
Apart from the worries that are ideological or philosophical or religious against vaccinations, there is also a worry about the after effects or the other effects that go with it. How do you allay those fears?
Yeah, absolutely. And people have raised questions to me of these vaccines have been developed so quickly. How do we know that they're safe in the long run? Those are all very, very good questions. And my answers are, first of all, every vaccine has to go through a series of clinical trials, a series of clinical steps. Every one of these COVID vaccines, certainly the Covishield, the Moderna, Pfizer, all of them have gone through those steps. So there have been no steps that have been missed. Second, these have been very large trials. Usually with drugs and vaccines, we can do approvals with few hundred people, 1,000 people. These are trials with tens of thousands of people in each trial. So the quality of the evidence is very good. The third thing I say is most of the side effects of vaccines show up in the weeks after the vaccination, days to weeks. And most of these vaccines have been followed already now for many months, and we're not seeing much in the way of side effects. And there's no real reason to think that somehow some side effect will show up 10 years later. That it doesn't really work that way. Any significant side effect, you'll see it within a few weeks, certainly by 2 months at the most. And we're not seeing them very often. They're very, very rare. And I guess the last point I will say is, to the extent that there are some side effects, they're very mild and they're much better than getting COVID itself. So if your choice is getting a vaccine or COVID, my goodness, there's no close call. But these vaccines, I think, are very safe. And I'm getting my first dose actually in 2 days, and my family will get vaccinated. Everybody I know, when they're able to, when their time comes up, will get vaccinated. And so you also have to lead by example and show people that you're getting vaccinated yourself.
Again, just explain to us when this vaccination happens in, say, 2 doses over time, the necessity of that. And there were some countries which were saying that, you won't give the second dose to people. I mean, the varying policies in terms of health policy.
Yeah. So all of these vaccines, certainly the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, I think the Covishield vaccine, all of them need a second dose. And the second dose is critically important because it is the second dose that really is the booster that gives you longer term immunity and stronger immune protection. So people should not be skipping a second dose. There is some debate among scientists of, do you need to give the second dose right away within 4 weeks? Can you wait a little bit longer? Can you wait to 6 or 8 or even 12 weeks? I think people are sorting some of that out. My personal feeling is a delay by a few weeks is probably not a problem. A delay by months probably is a problem. But so people should, first of all, everybody needs to get the second dose, but then making sure you get it in timely fashion is important.
In timely fashion, when you're talking about countries like India, Africa, the other poor countries, big countries where it has to go out to rural areas, the different vaccines which are storable at different temperatures, some of them are only 2 to 8 degrees, which seems to be better for countries that have a huge amount of people that they need to get to and rural areas. How do you view that whole picture there?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Like, look, the good news here is India's got a long history of being able to manage complex vaccination programs and has done a very good job in the past with a variety of vaccination programs, not the least of which, of course, is polio, but they've done it for so many others as well. So India has a lot of capability in this area, but that is not to say it's not going to be hard. It will be hard. We will have to think about storage. There are some vaccines that are going to be very difficult. Ones that have to be stored frozen may not be possible. So we're going to want more stable vaccines. There are vaccines coming. Johnson and Johnson is about to release a vaccine, their data in the next week or so, that is largely stable at much warmer temperatures than the others. So I think there's going to be a whole set of options, but it's going to be a very large logistical challenge. I think about, I'm from Bihar and my family still lives in Madhubani. Getting vaccines out to Madhubani, but also to the villages around there. It's going to be a lot of work.
In terms of world leadership, there was so much criticism of leaders not stepping up to the plate, the United Nations being nowhere, WHO, the China factor there, and how there were accusations of Dr. Tedros working on behalf of Beijing. The Biden administration's decision to return to the WHO, how important is that in terms of tackling COVID for the world, not just for the US?
I think it's critically important. I mean, look, WHO is not a perfect organization. WHO needs a certain set of reforms. There are important changes that need to be made. We really need to rethink our entire strategy on global health coming out of this pandemic. But the Trump administration's attitude of we don't like something WHO did and therefore we're leaving was incredibly childish. I mean, that's sort of what kids do. You get upset, you don't like it, and you take your ball and you say, okay, I'm going home. That's not how adults behave. And it's very important that the Biden team has signaled that America is rejoining WHO. We need to be part of the solution for a global approach to vaccinations and global. And if there are problems with WHO, and again, WHO has done, I think, a pretty good job. They've had some stumbles. Let's work on improving them. But there's no alternative to WHO. The WHO plays a critical role in global public health. And if we walk away, we're not going to be able to create a new agency. We need WHO to be effective. So it's important that we engage to help WHO be effective.
We talked about how it was the rich and the powerful who would be first in line to get the vaccinations in terms of countries or people within countries. How do you view what's being called COVID vaccine diplomacy now? I mean, in our region, India is helping out the neighbors and even the outlying neighbors. We're going to Seychelles and Mauritius as well. And China is doing the same in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, in Africa, in parts of Europe, Pakistan maybe. How do you view that in terms of benefit to the people and how countries are playing their games?
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, first and foremost, the fact that vaccines are, through vaccine diplomacy, getting out to countries that don't have indigenous production facilities, I think is good news. Like, look, we've more than anything else, we want people around the world getting vaccinated. But I don't want vaccine diplomacy to be driven primarily by political considerations, meaning I don't want one country to get it and another country to not, based on their relationship with the manufacturing nation. That's not going to be where we want to land. And that's why I think something like COVAX, which was jointly developed by WHO and Gavi and others to make sure that everybody who's high risk gets vaccinated first, I think is going to be very important. So we'll always have some amount of diplomacy, bilateral relationships, giving this and that. But I also think we need a global approach to make sure that individual national diplomatic interests don't end up becoming the major driver for who gets vaccinated and who doesn't.
And Dr. Jha, in terms of the lessons learned from the past and now COVID, which the world continues to grapple with and try to overcome, how prepared do you think the world will be? Of course, we deal with this first, but for the next time, pandemic.
So there will be another time. I mean, let's be honest with with each other. All of the factors that led to this pandemic haven't gone away, and there will be another time. I think one of the kind of misunderstandings of many, certainly of the Trump administration, was that somehow you can reverse globalization, that you can go back to a world where you can put up walls and keep your country safe. The Great Wall of China did not keep those dynasties safe. That is not going to be a possibility in 2021 or moving forward. We live in a highly globalized, not just highly interconnected, but highly interdependent world, right? Even if you think about something like pharmaceutical manufacturing, ingredients will come from one country, manufacturing will come from another country, distribution will be in a third country. And so we have to take a much more global strategy to these things and work much more cooperatively together. I'm hoping that is a lesson that is clear now to public health. I'm sorry, not to public health, but to political leaders. It's always been clear to public health leaders, but it becomes clear to the political leaders that is the strategy that is going to work. You can't just have every country on their own. Not in this world, not in the ways that we are interconnected, interdependent. Can you hear me okay?
Dr. Ashish K. Jha, again, absolutely appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us on StratNews Global.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being here.
Just a reminder to all our viewers and